Hi guys, welcome back to another deep dive into history's most fascinating cultures. Tonight, we're stepping back over 1,000 years to explore the daily existence of one of history's most misunderstood peoples, the Vikings. But this isn't the Hollywood version you might expect, filled with constant raids and endless battles. Instead, we're going to walk through an ordinary day in the life of Bjorn Ironside, a Viking warrior living in 9th century Norway. We'll experience his world from the moment he wakes in his longhouse to when he finally rests his head on his straw pillow. You'll discover that Viking life was far more complex and surprisingly mundane than popular culture suggests. From tending livestock and crafting tools to participating in community decisions and maintaining family relationships, the Vikings lived rich, multifaceted lives that extended far beyond their reputation as fierce raiders. Tonight's journey will take us through the seasons, the social structures, the daily routines, and the quiet moments that defined Viking existence. We'll explore their homes, their food, their work, their relationships, and their beliefs through the eyes of one man whose life represents thousands of others who lived, loved, and died in the fjords and forests of medieval Scandinavia. Okay, friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I really enjoy seeing where everyone is listening. Now dim the lights and turn on the fan. And let's dive into tonight's journey. The first pale light of dawn crept through the small window opening of the longhouse, casting long shadows across the packed earth floor, where Bjorn Ironside lay sleeping on his bed of straw. The leather curtain that served as a window covering fluttered gently in the morning breeze, and somewhere in the distance, a rooster announced the arrival of another day in the village. Bjorn's eyes opened slowly, his body naturally attuned to the rhythms of daylight after years of rising. The longhouse was still mostly quiet, save for the soft breathing of his family members sleeping in their respective alcoves along the walls, and the gentle crackling of embers in the central hearth that had burned low during the night. Bjorn stretched his muscular frame, feeling the familiar ache in his sword arm from yesterday's training session with the younger men of the village. At 32 years old, he was considered to be in his prime as a warrior, though he had not sailed on a raid in over 2 years, choosing instead to focus on his farm and his growing family. His wife, Astrid, slept peacefully beside him, her blonde hair spread across the pillow they shared, while their 2 young children, Eric and Ingrid, were curled up in their own small bed across the room. The smell of wood smoke, dried fish, and the earthy scent of the livestock that shared the other end of the longhouse created the familiar atmosphere that meant home to Bjorn and his family. Rising quietly so as not to wake his wife, Bjorn swung his legs over the side of the bed and placed his feet on the cold earth floor. The morning air was crisp, typical for late spring in Norway, and he could hear the gentle lowing of their cattle from the other end of the longhouse where the animals were kept during the colder months. Though it was now warm enough for the livestock to graze outside during the day, they were still brought in each night for protection from wolves and other predators that roamed the surrounding forests. Bjorn pulled on his wool tunic and leather breeches, the same practical clothing he wore almost every day, designed for durability rather than fashion,
though the intricate embroidery around the neck and sleeves showed Astrid's skilled needlework and marked his status as a free man rather than a thrall. The longhouse that Bjorn called home was typical of Viking dwellings, measuring roughly 60 feet in length and 20 feet in width, with walls made of timber and turf that provided excellent insulation against the harsh Scandinavian weather. The interior was divided into several sections, with the family's living quarters occupying the center portion, the livestock housed at one end, and storage areas for grain, tools, and preserved food. The central hearth was the heart of the home, providing warmth, light, and a place to cook meals, while the smoke escaped through a hole in the roof that could be partially covered during rain or snow. Along the walls, raised platforms served as beds, benches, and workspace, while wooden chests held the family's most precious possessions, including Bjorn's weapons, Astrid's jewelry, and the few books that had been acquired through trade with Christian. As Bjorn made his way toward the door, he paused to check on his children, pulling their woolen blankets up around their shoulders as they slept. Young Eric, at 7 years old, was already showing signs of his father's strong build and determined personality, while 4-year-old Ingrid possessed her mother's gentle nature and quick intelligence. Both children would soon be old enough to begin learning the skills they would need as adults, with Eric eventually training in the arts of war and farming, while Ingrid would master the complex crafts of textile production, food preservation, and household management that were essential to Viking survival. For now, though, they were allowed to sleep peacefully while their parents began the day's work. Stepping outside the longhouse, Bjorn was greeted by the familiar sights and sounds of the village awakening to another day. Kaupang was a thriving settlement of perhaps 200 souls, situated on a natural harbor that made it an important trading center for merchants traveling between the various kingdoms of Scandinavia. The village consisted of roughly 40 longhouses of varying sizes, along with numerous smaller buildings used for specific crafts like metalworking, pottery, and textile production. Smoke was already rising from several chimneys as other families began preparing their morning meals, while dogs wandered through the streets and children's voices could be heard from some of the houses where the younger ones had already awakened. The first task of Bjorn's day was to tend to the animals, a responsibility that could not be delayed regardless of weather or personal. He walked to the end of the longhouse where the livestock were kept, greeting his small herd of cattle, sheep, and goats with the gentle voice that all successful farmers used with their animals. The cattle lowed softly as they recognized their master, while the goats pressed forward eagerly, knowing that morning meant fresh hay and the opportunity to venture outside for grazing. Bjorn had inherited most of these animals from his father, and over the years had managed to increase the size of his herd through careful breeding and shrewd trading at the season. Leading the animals out through the large door at the end of the longhouse, Bjorn guided them to the fenced pasture area the grass was thick and green with spring growth, and the animals immediately began grazing with the contentment that comes from animals well cared for by experience. He checked each animal carefully as they settled into their morning routine, looking for any signs of illness or injury that might require attention from the village's animal healer. One of the younger cows appeared to be favoring her left front leg slightly, and Bjorn made a mental note to examine her more closely later in the day,
though for now she seemed to be moving well enough to graze north. While the animals settled into their pasture, Bjorn turned his attention to the vegetable garden. The growing season in Norway was short but intensive, and every square foot of cultivated land had to rows of barley, oats, and rye stretched across the carefully maintained fields, while smaller plots closer to the house contained. The soil was rich and dark, enriched by years of careful composting using animal manure and kitchen scraps, and Bjorn could see the sound of footsteps behind him announced the arrival of his neighbor, Olaf the Stout, whose own longhouse sat just 50 yards away across a small stream. Olaf was a few years older than Bjorn and served as one of the village's most respected elders. His advice sought on everything from farming techniques to legal disputes. The two men had been friends since childhood, having grown up together in the village and participated in several trading expeditions to the markets of Denmark, and now both were settled family men, more concerned with crops and cattle than with the adventures that had once seemed. "Good morning, Bjorn," Olaf called out as he approached, carrying a wooden bucket that he had "The morning looks fair for. I was thinking we might want to start bringing in that hay from the lower meadow." The two men stood together in the morning sunlight, discussing the practical matters that occupied the minds of farmers everywhere, regardless of time period or geographic location. The hay harvest was critically important, as it would provide food for their livestock during the winter months when snow covered the ground and grazing was impossible. A poor hay harvest could mean the difference between animals surviving the winter or having to be. As they talked, both men kept one eye on their grazing animals and another on the sky, reading the. A lifetime of experience had taught them to notice the direction of the wind, the shape and color of the clouds, and the behavior of birds and other wildlife that might indicate. Today, the signs were favorable, with a gentle breeze from the south and high white clouds that suggested stable weather. This was important information for planning the day's activities, as certain tasks like harvesting grain or making repairs to buildings. Their conversation was interrupted by the appearance of Astrid, who emerged from the longhouse carrying a wood. She moved with the graceful efficiency that characterized women who had mastered the complex art of managing a medieval household. Her dress was made of wool that she had spun herself from the fleece of their sheep, dyed a deep blue using woad that had been traded from merchants who traveled the river. The intricate embroidery around the neck and sleeves of her dress demonstrated skills that had been passed down from her mother and grandmother, techniques that were jealously guarded secrets within families of craftswomen. "The children are still sleeping," Astrid said as she handed the bowl to her husband, "but they should be awake soon. I've set aside some of the porridge for them, and there's fresh milk from yesterday evening's milking." The morning meal was simple but nourishing, consisting of porridge made from barley and oats, flavored with honey and enriched with milk from their own. A piece of dried fish provided additional protein, while a small portion of cheese made from goat's milk added variety to the. This meal would provide Bjorn with the energy he needed for the physical labor that lay ahead, though he would eat again at midday and in the evening when the family gathered around the hearth for their main. As Bjorn ate his breakfast, he watched the village continuing to come to life. Smoke was now rising from most of the longhouses as families began their morning cooking.
while men emerged from their homes to tend to their own animals and begin the children's voices could be heard from several directions as the younger members of the community awakened and began their own daily routines, which might include helping with animal care, gathering eggs from chickens, or assisting their mothers with various. The village was a close-knit community where everyone knew their neighbors and where cooperation was essential for survival in a harsh and unforgiving. Near the center of the village, Bjorn could see Thorvald the blacksmith already at work at his forge, the bright orange glow of heated iron visible through the open door. The rhythmic hammering of metal on metal created a steady soundtrack for the morning activities, as Thorvald shaped tools, weapons, and household items that were essential to the daily life.
Blacksmithing was one of the most important crafts in Viking society, requiring years of training and experience to master. And a skilled blacksmith like Thorvald was highly respected and well compensated. He traded his products not only within the village, but also with merchants and traders who carried Viking metalwork throughout Scandinavia. And after finishing his breakfast, Bjorn returned the empty bowl to Astrid and prepared to begin the day's main tasks. Today, he planned to work on repairing the roof of the small barn where they stored hay and grain, a job that had been postponed during the recent period of wet weather but could no longer be delayed. The wooden shingles had begun to curl and separate in several places, allowing rain to seep through and potentially damage the precious stores of food that would sustain his family. This type of maintenance work was a constant requirement for Viking farmers, as the harsh climate and limited availability of building materials meant that structures required frequent attention to remain functional, and the repair work would require several different skills and tools, all of which Bjorn had acquired through years of experience and training that began in. He would need to shape new wooden shingles using his axe and knife, a process that required careful attention to the grain of the wood to ensure that the finished pieces would shed water effectively without splitting. The old, damaged shingles would have to be carefully removed without disturbing the underlying structure, while the new pieces would need to be fitted precisely and secured with wooden pegs that he would. This type of detailed handwork was typical of Viking craftsmanship, where individual skill and attention to quality were essential for creating durable products that could withstand the demanding conditions of. Before beginning the roof repair, Bjorn took a few minutes to gather the tools and materials he would need for. His tool collection represented years of careful acquisition and maintenance, with some pieces inherited from his father and others acquired through trade or crafted by his own. The most important tool was his axe, a beautifully balanced weapon and implement that served multiple purposes. The iron head had been forged by Thorvald several years earlier and fitted to a handle of seasoned ash wood that Bjorn had carefully selected and shaped to fit his. The axe could be used for everything from felling trees and splitting wood to shaping timber and, if necessary, defending his family and property from human or animal. In addition to the axe, Bjorn's toolkit included several knives of different sizes and shapes, each designed for specific tasks, ranging from fine carving work to cutting rope. A wooden mallet would be useful for driving wooden pegs without damaging the surrounding wood, while a collection of iron nails and wooden pegs would provide the fasteners needed to secure the new shingles. All of these tools were kept sharp and well maintained,
as dull or damaged implements were not only inefficient but could also be dangerous when used for the heavy work that characterized Viking. The time invested in tool maintenance was always repaid by improved efficiency and safety during actual work. As Bjorn climbed onto the roof of the barn, he could see across the entire village and the surrounding countryside that stretched away toward the distance. The view from this elevated position gave him a different perspective on the community where he had lived his entire life, allowing him to observe the patterns of activity that characterized a typical morning. Women were hanging clothes and bedding out to dry in the morning breeze, taking advantage of what promised to be a sunny day to refresh textiles that had been stored inside during the recent period. Children were playing games in the spaces between houses, their laughter and shouts adding a cheerful soundtrack to the more serious business of adult work that occupied most of the community. The work of removing damaged shingles and replacing them with new ones was methodical and time-consuming, requiring careful attention to detail at each step of the process. Bjorn began by examining the entire roof surface to identify all of the areas that needed repair, marking each problem spot with small stones that would help him keep track of his progress as the work continued. Some shingles had simply come loose and could be reattached with new pegs, while others had cracked or warped beyond repair and would need to be complete. The most challenging repairs were in areas where water damage had affected not only the surface shingles, but also the underlying wooden structure, requiring more extensive work to ensure that the roof would remain waterproof. As he worked, Bjorn found his mind wandering to the larger questions that occupied the thoughts of many Viking men during this period. The world was changing rapidly as Christianity spread throughout Scandinavia, bringing with it new ideas about everything from religion and social organization to art and many of the younger men in the village were attracted to the opportunities that might be found by joining the crews of ships sailing to distant lands, whether for trade or for the raids that had made the Vikings famous. For his part, Bjorn was content with the life he had built in Kaupang. But he sometimes wondered what adventures he might be missing by choosing the security of farming over the excitement of exploration. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky as Bjorn continued his methodical work on the roof, and he could feel the warmth beginning to penetrate the cool air that had characterized the early hours. This was perfect weather for outdoor work, with enough warmth to make physical labor comfortable, but not so much heat as to make heavy work exhausting. He had removed all of the damaged shingles and was now beginning the process of installing their replacements, a task that required both physical skill and mental concentration to ensure that each piece was properly fitted and secure. The rhythm of the work was almost meditative, allowing his hands to follow familiar motions, while his mind was free to wander over the events and concerns that filled his. From his position on the roof, Bjorn had an excellent view of the harbor, where several merchant ships were anchored, their crews preparing for departure on trading voyages that would take them to markets throughout Scandinavia. One ship was being loaded with furs, amber, and iron goods that would be traded for silver, silk, and spices in the markets of Constantinople, while another was taking on supplies for a voyage to Iceland, where a new colony of Norwegian settlers was establishing farms and communities in the volcanic landscape of. The sight of these ships preparing for departure stirred something in Bjorn's heart. A reminder of the wanderlust that had once driven him to seek adventure beyond the familiar boundaries of his. The sound of children's voices from the street below drew Bjorn's attention away from the ships in the harbor, and he looked down to see his own son Eric playing with several other boys in a game that involved wooden swords. The children were reenacting some heroic saga that they had heard told around the evening fires, their imagination transforming the dusty street into a great battlefield where brave warriors performed might. Watching his son at play, Bjorn was reminded of his own childhood when he had engaged in similar games, never imagining that he would one day choose the quiet life of a farmer over the glory that was supposed to come with a war. There was no regret in this observation, merely the recognition that life had taken him in directions that his younger self could never. By mid-morning, Bjorn had completed roughly half of the roof repair work, making steady progress despite the meticulous attention to detail that his hands were beginning to show the effects of handling rough wood and metal tools for several hours, with small cuts and splinters that were the inevitable result of this. These minor injuries were so common among Vikings that they were hardly noticed, simply accepted as part of the price of making a living through physical labor in a world where most work was done by hand, using the calluses on Bjorn's palms were thick and hard, built up over years of similar work, and they provided some protection against the worst effects of handling rough materials, though they could not prevent all of the small wounds that accumulated during a day. The approach of midday brought with it the need for a break from work and a chance to eat the meal that would provide energy for the afternoon. Bjorn climbed down from the roof and walked back toward his longhouse, where he could see smoke rising from the cooking fire that Astrid had rekindled to prepare the family's main meal. The children were now awake and playing outside, their energy and enthusiasm a sharp contrast to the steady, methodical approach that characterized adult. Eric ran up to his father as he approached the house, eager to show him a small wooden horse that he had been carving with the knife that Bjorn had given him for his last. The carving showed real promise, with clean lines and careful attention to proportion that suggested the boy had inherited his father's skill with tools and eye for craft. Inside the longhouse, Astrid was tending a large iron cauldron suspended over the central fire, stirring a stew that contained pieces of mutton, root vegetables, and barley that would provide a hearty and nourishing meal. The rich aroma filled the interior of the house, mixing with the smoke from the fire and the various other scents that characterized a This was the main meal of the day, more substantial and varied than the simple porridge that had served as breakfast, and it represented the culmination of hours of work by Astrid, who had risen early to prepare the various The mutton came from one of their own sheep that had been slaughtered earlier in the spring, while the vegetables had been preserved from the previous year's harvest using techniques of drying and fermentation that allowed Viking families to maintain a varied diet throughout the. As the family gathered around the central hearth to share their meal, conversation naturally turned to the events and concerns that were occupying each person. Eric was excited about the progress he was making in his carving project and asked his father for advice about how to shape the horse's legs to make them look more real. Ingrid had spent the morning helping her mother with various household tasks and was proud of her success in spinning wool into thread, a skill that required considerable practice. Astrid reported on her observations of the garden and livestock, noting that one of the goats appeared to be pregnant and that the barley was showing good growth despite the late start to the planting season. These domestic concerns formed the fabric of daily life for Viking families, creating bonds of shared interest and mutual dependence that were essential for survival in a challenging environment.
The meal also provided an opportunity for Bjorn to share news and information that he had gathered from his interactions with neighbors and other members of the community. Olaf had mentioned that traders from Denmark were expected to arrive in the village within the next few days, bringing goods and news from the southern kingdoms where political changes were affecting trade routes and economic. There were rumors that the King of Denmark was planning new expeditions to the west, possibly to the rich monasteries of Ireland and England that had been the source of so much wealth for Viking raiders in previous generations. For farmers like Bjorn, these distant events were of interest primarily for their potential effects on trade and the availability of goods that could not be produced locally. Though the romantic appeal of adventure and conquest still stirred something in the hearts of men who had once dreamed of winning fame and fortune with sword and axe. After the meal was finished and the dishes cleaned and put away, Bjorn returned to his work on the barn roof, determined to complete the repairs before evening brought an end to the... The afternoon sun was now high and warm, making the physical labor more demanding than it had been during the cooler. Sweat began to gather on his forehead and arms as he continued the methodical process of shaping, fitting, and installing the wooden shingles that would protect the building's contents from rain. This type of work required not only physical strength and endurance, but also the mental discipline to maintain consistent quality and attention to detail, even when fatigue began to affect concentration and the rhythm of the work was interrupted occasionally by interactions with neighbors and community members who passed by on their own errands or who stopped to chat and share. Thorvald the blacksmith paused on his way to the harbor to examine a broken tool that needed repair, taking the opportunity to discuss with Bjorn the quality of iron that was available from the local bog deposits that provided the raw material for much of the metalwork. Ingrid, the widow who lived in the small house next to the village well, stopped to ask whether Bjorn had noticed any signs of wolves in the forest where he sometimes hunted, as she was concerned about the safety of her chickens that she allowed to roam free. These casual interactions were an important part of village life, helping to maintain the social connections and flow of information that were essential for community survival. And as the afternoon progressed, Bjorn found himself thinking about the seasonal cycle that governed so much of Viking life, and the preparations that would soon be necessary for the approach. Although it was only late spring, experienced farmers and householders were already beginning to plan for the long, cold months that would eventually bring snow and ice to cover the landscape. For the hay harvest would need to be completed during the short summer season, while vegetables would have to be preserved using various techniques of drying, smoking, and livestock would need to be carefully managed to ensure that enough animals survived the winter to provide breeding stock for the following year, while also providing meat, milk, and hides for the family's sustenance. These concerns required constant attention and forward planning, as mistakes made during the productive season could have consequences that lasted throughout the entire winter. The work on the roof was nearing completion as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting longer shadows across the village and painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that promised fair weather for the... Bjorn installed the final few shingles with the satisfaction that comes from completing a necessary task to the highest standards of craftsmanship and each piece of wood had been carefully shaped and fitted, creating a roof surface that would shed water effectively and protect the valuable contents of the building for many years. This type of quality work was characteristic of Viking construction, where the harsh climate and limited availability of materials made it essential to build things right the first time, rather than accepting poor workmanship that would require frequent repair. Climbing down from the completed roof, Bjorn took a moment to survey his work from ground level, checking for any obvious problems or areas that might need addition. The new shingles blended well with the existing portions of the roof, creating a uniform appearance that was both functional and aesthetic. The building itself looked solid and well maintained, a reflection of the care and attention that Bjorn devoted to all aspects of his property. And this attention to detail was not merely a matter of personal pride, but rather a practical necessity in a world where the failure of buildings, tools, or equipment could have serious consequences for family survival. And with the roof repair completed, Bjorn turned his attention to the evening tasks that were necessary to properly conclude the day. The livestock needed to be brought in from the pasture and secured in their night quarters, while various tools and materials had to be cleaned and stored in their The animals were content to be led back into the familiar environment of the longhouse, where they would be safe from predators and sheltered from any changes in weather that might occur. Each cow, sheep, and goat was checked carefully as it entered the building, with Bjorn looking for any signs of injury or illness that might require attention from the villages. The young cow that had appeared to favor her front leg that morning seemed to be moving normally now, suggesting that the problem had been minor and had resolved itself during the day of normal grazing. As evening approached, the pace of activity in the village began to slow, as families completed their daily work and prepared for the evening meal and the social activities that traditionally follow. Smoke began to rise more thickly from the chimneys of the longhouses as cooking fires were stoked to higher levels to prepare the substantial meals that would restore energy depleted by a day of physical labor. The sound of children's voices became more prominent as they were called in from their play to help with evening chores and to prepare for the family gatherings that were an important part of Vikings. These evening hours were often the most pleasant part of the day, when the pressures of work gave way to the satisfactions of family life and community. Inside his own longhouse, Bjorn found Astrid preparing what would be the final meal of the day. A simpler affair than the midday feast, but still substantial enough to satisfy the appetites of family members who had spent the day in various forms of productive activity. The menu included bread baked from flour ground from their own grain, cheese made from the milk of their goats, and portions of the stew left over from the midday meal, along with ale that Astrid brewed using techniques that had been passed down through generations of Viking. This evening meal was as much about family togetherness as it was about nutrition, providing an opportunity for parents and children to share the experiences of their day and to strengthen the bonds that held the household together through good times and bad. The conversation around the evening fire covered a wide range of topics, from practical concerns about farm management and household maintenance to stories and legends that connected the family to the broader cultural traditions of their people. Eric was eager to hear again the saga of his great-grandfather's adventures as a young man when he had sailed with a crew of Vikings to the markets of Kiev and Constantinople, returning with silver and silk that had provided the foundation for the family's current prosperity. Ingrid preferred the gentler stories that featured clever women who used their intelligence and skills to solve problems and help their families, tales that reinforced the important roles that Viking women played in their society. These stories served multiple purposes, entertaining the children while also transmitting cultural values and historical memories that connected the present generation to their ancestors and traditions. As the evening progressed and the fire burned lower, the family's activities gradually shifted toward the quieter pursuits that were appropriate for the end of the day. Astrid continued working on a piece of embroidery that would eventually become part of a new dress for Ingrid, her skilled fingers creating intricate patterns that demonstrated the high level of artistic achievement that characterized Viking textiles. Bjorn used the time to maintain and sharpen some of his tools, a task that was essential for maintaining efficiency and safety, but that could be done while participating in family conversation. The children played quiet games or worked on their own projects. Eric continuing to carve his wooden horse, while Ingrid practiced the spinning techniques that she was learning under her mother's careful instruction. The evening also provided an opportunity for Bjorn to reflect on the day's accomplishments and to plan for the activities that would occupy tomorrow's working hours. The roof repair had been completed successfully and would not require attention again for several years, freeing up time for other maintenance projects that were always waiting to be addressed on a working farm. The weather appeared to be settling into a stable pattern that would be favorable for agricultural work, suggesting that the next few days might be ideal for beginning the hay harvest in the lower meadows where the grass was already reaching optimal height. These plans were always tentative, subject to change based on weather conditions, the needs of livestock, and the various unexpected events that were a normal part of rural life. But having some sense of direction helped to organize time. As full darkness settled over the village, the sounds from outside the longhouse gradually faded to the quiet murmur of voices from other houses, and the occasional barking of dogs responding to some The central fire had burned down to glowing coals that provided gentle warmth and just enough light for the family's quiet evening activities, creating an atmosphere of peace and contentment that was the reward for a day of This was the time of day that Bjorn treasured most, when the pressures and responsibilities of maintaining a farm and supporting a family gave way to the simple pleasures of being together with the people he loved most in the world, sharing stories, working on individual projects, and enjoying the satisfaction that comes from a life well lived according to the values and traditions of their. The transition from evening activities to nighttime rest was gradual and natural, following patterns that had been established over years of family. As the fire burned lower and the light dimmed, conversations became quieter and more sporadic, while individual activities were put aside in preparation. Astrid carefully stored her needlework in the wooden chest where she kept her sewing supplies and precious possessions, while Bjorn checked to make sure that his tools were properly cleaned and arranged for tomorrow. The children began to show the signs of tiredness that indicated they were ready for bed, their earlier energy giving way to the sleepiness that comes naturally at the end of an active day. Before retiring for the night,
Bjorn performed the security checks that were a necessary part of life in a world where the protection of family and property depended largely on individual vigilance and preparation.
He examined the door fastenings to make sure they were secure, checked on the livestock to ensure that they were settled comfortably for the night, and looked around the immediate area surrounding the longhouse for any signs of unusual activity that might indicate potential.
These precautions were routine rather than responses to any specific threat, but they reflected the reality that Viking families lived in a world where personal security could not be taken for granted and where preparedness was essential for survival. Satisfied that everything was secure for the night, Bjorn returned to the family area of the longhouse, where Astrid was helping the children prepare.
The bedtime routine was simple but comforting, involving the practical tasks of arranging sleeping furs and checking that each family member had adequate warmth for the cool. A few quiet words of affection and encouragement helped to end the day on a positive note, reinforcing the family bonds that were so essential to Viking social life, and creating the sense of security and belonging that allowed children to grow up with confidence in their place in. These moments of tenderness and care were as important as any of the day's more dramatic activities, representing the foundation of emotional support that enabled individuals to face the challenges and uncertainties of life with courage and determination. As Bjorn settled onto his bed of straw and furs beside his sleeping wife, he could hear the gentle sounds of the night settling over the soft breathing of his children, the occasional movement of livestock at the other end of the longhouse, and the distant sounds of other families concluding their own daily routines created a peaceful atmosphere that encouraged rest and restoration after the physical and mental. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, new tasks to be completed and problems to be solved. But for now, there was only the satisfaction of another day well lived and the prospect of restorative sleep that would prepare him for whatever adventures the future. The rhythm of daily life that Bjorn experienced was repeated in countless variations throughout the Viking world, as families and communities adapted the basic patterns of agricultural and domestic life to the specific conditions of their local environment. Whether they lived in the fjords of Norway, the forests of Sweden, or the islands of Denmark, Viking families shared common challenges and common solutions that created a distinctive culture and way of life that would influence the history of Europe for the quiet heroism of daily survival, the steady accumulation of skills and knowledge, and the deep bonds of family and community that sustained people through both prosperity and hardship represented the true foundation of Viking civilization, far more significant than the raids and conquests that would capture the attention of historians and storytellers. The next morning brought another cycle of the same essential activities, though with variations that reflected the changing seasons, weather conditions, and specific needs of family and. Bjorn woke again with the dawn light, his body naturally attuned to the solar rhythms that governed agricultural life throughout. The morning air carried the scent of rain that had fallen during the night, bringing welcome moisture to the growing crops and replenishing the water sources that were essential for both human and animal. The sound of water dripping from the eaves of the longhouse created a gentle percussion that mixed with the stirring sounds of the awakening village to announce the beginning of another day in the endless cycle of seasons that measured the passage of Viking life. Today's priorities would be somewhat different from yesterday's focus on roof repair,
as the overnight rain had created ideal conditions for certain types of agricultural work, while making others temporarily the wet soil would be perfect for transplanting vegetable seedlings that Astrid had been nurturing in small containers near the warmth of the central hearth. But the same moisture would make it inadvisable to begin cutting hay in the lower meadows, where the grass would now be too wet to dry properly. This constant need to adapt plans and activities to changing environmental conditions was one of the most challenging aspects of Viking agricultural life, requiring flexibility, experience, and good judgment to make the most of whatever opportunities. As Bjorn began his morning routine of caring for the livestock, he noticed that the pregnant goat that Astrid had identified yesterday was showing signs that she might give birth within the next. Her behavior had changed subtly, with a restlessness and tendency to seek out secluded corners that experienced farmers recognized as indicators of approach. This was welcome news for the family, as goat kids born in late spring had the best chance of growing strong and healthy before the onset of winter. And the additional milk production from a freshly lactating goat would provide valuable nutrition for the family throughout the summer months. However, it also meant that someone would need to keep a close watch on the animal to ensure that she received assistance if complications arose during the birthing process. The morning's animal care tasks were completed more quickly than usual, as the overnight rain had provided abundant water in all the natural basins and streams that served the livestock. This eliminated the time-consuming chore of carrying water from the village well to fill the wooden troughs that normally required daily attention, freeing up time for other activities that might benefit from the favorable conditions created by the night's precipitation. Bjorn used this extra time to examine more carefully the condition of his farming tools, several of which had shown signs of wear during recent use and would benefit from maintenance work before being needed for the intensive agricultural activities of. The community aspects of Viking life became more apparent as the morning progressed, with neighbors and friends stopping by to discuss the effects of the night's rain on their own crops. And Eric's best friend Magnus arrived with his father Gunnar, who wanted to coordinate with Bjorn regarding the shared use of a plow that the two families had purchased together from a traveling craftsman several. The iron plowshare was too expensive for either family to purchase individually, but by pooling their resources and agreeing to share the implement during different periods of the planting season, both were able to benefit from technology that significantly improved their agricultural productivity compared to the simpler digging sticks and hoes that had been used by. This type of cooperative arrangement was typical of Viking communities, where the harsh environment and limited resources made it essential for families to work together and share both costs and benefits. Tool sharing, labor exchange, and collective decision-making about matters affecting the entire community created social bonds that were as important for survival as the more obvious necessities of food. These relationships were maintained through a complex system of mutual obligations and reciprocal assistance that ensured no family would face crisis alone, while also creating the social cohesion necessary for defending the community against external threats, whether from human raiders or The morning's conversation with Gunnar also provided an opportunity to discuss the broader economic conditions that affected farming communities throughout. Reports from traveling merchants suggested that demand for Viking agricultural products was increasing in the growing towns and cities of Denmark and southern Sweden,
where populations engaged in specialized crafts and trade had less time and land available. This created opportunities for farmers like Bjorn and Gunnar to produce surplus crops for sale, potentially generating income that could be used to purchase manufactured goods, luxury items, and raw materials that were not. However, it also meant that farming was becoming more competitive and market-oriented, requiring farmers to make decisions not only on their family's immediate needs, but also on their assessment of distant market conditions that were difficult to predict and impossible. As the two men discussed these larger economic trends, their sons, Eric and Magnus, were engaged in their own activities that reflected the ways in which children learned the skills and knowledge they would need. The boys were practicing with wooden swords and shields, developing the coordination and strength that would be essential whether they eventually chose careers as warriors, farmers. Their mock combats were carefully supervised by the adults, who provided instruction on proper techniques while ensuring that the spirited competition did not result in serious injuries that could have long-term consequences for the children's health. And this type of play-based learning was an important part of Viking education, allowing children to acquire complex skills through activities that were enjoyable and engaging rather than tedious. Meanwhile, Astrid and Ingrid were working together on the task of transplanting the vegetable seedlings that had been started earlier in the season, taking advantage of the perfect soil conditions created by the previous night's rain. The process required careful attention to detail, as each small plant had to be removed from its temporary container without damaging the delicate root system, placed in a properly prepared hole in the garden soil, and then watered and protected to ensure successful establishment in its new location. This work demanded patience and skill, qualities that Ingrid was developing under her mother's careful guidance as part of her preparation for the adult responsibilities she would eventually assume as a. The garden itself was a testament to the horticultural knowledge and skills that Viking women had developed over generations of experience with the challenging growing conditions of. The carefully planned arrangement of different vegetables took into account factors such as soil requirements, water needs, susceptibility to pests and diseases, and the optimal timing for planting and harvesting. Companion planting techniques were used to maximize productivity while minimizing problems, with certain combinations of plants providing mutual benefits in terms of pest control, soil improvement, and efficient use of. These sophisticated agricultural practices were based on accumulated knowledge that was passed down from mother to daughter through practical experience rather than written records, creating a tradition of expertise that was essential for family survival. And as the morning progressed toward midday, the effects of the previous night's rain became more apparent throughout the village and surrounding countryside. The grain crops in the fields showed the bright green color and vigorous growth that indicated they were responding well to the additional moisture, while the vegetable gardens displayed the lush appearance that promised good harvests in the coming months. Streams and ponds throughout the area were running higher than they had been for several weeks, providing abundant water for both agricultural and domestic use during what was typically a drier period of the late spring. These favorable conditions were welcomed by everyone in the farming community, as they suggested that the growing season was developing in ways that would support good harvests and adequate food supplies for the. The midday meal provided another opportunity for family members to share information and coordinate their activities for the remainder.
Astrid reported that the transplanting work was proceeding well and should be completed by evening, while also noting that several of the chickens appeared to be showing signs of broodiness that might indicate they were preparing to hatch. Bjorn shared his observations about the pregnant goat and suggested that they should prepare a clean, comfortable area where she could give birth safely when the time. The children contributed their own observations about various animals and growing things that had caught their attention during the morning's activities, demonstrating the close connection with the natural world that was characteristic of. The afternoon's work focused on tasks that were well suited to the current weather conditions and the family's immediate. Bjorn decided to use the time for maintenance work on the wooden fence that surrounded the vegetable garden, as several sections had been damaged by the winter's freezing and thawing cycles and needed repair before the growing crops became large enough to attract the attention of hungry deer. This type of preventive maintenance was a constant requirement in Viking settlements, where the harsh climate and the primitive tools available for construction meant that all structures required frequent attention to remain functional. The fence repair work required many of the same skills that Bjorn had used for the previous day's roof project, including the ability to shape wood precisely using simple hand tools and the knowledge of construction techniques that would create durable structures using locally available. However, it also demanded an understanding of animal behavior and the specific strategies that different types of wildlife might use to gain access to cultivation. Deer were persistent and clever in their attempts to reach garden vegetables, capable of jumping over barriers that seemed adequately high, and of finding weak spots in fencing that might not be apparent to humans. Constructing effective wildlife barriers required not only technical skill, but also a deep understanding of animal psychology and behavior patterns that came only through years of experience. As Bjorn worked on the fence repairs, he was joined by his son Eric, who was eager to learn more about construction techniques and to contribute to the family's work in whatever ways his developing skills. The boy's enthusiasm was tempered by the recognition that woodworking required patience and precision that could only be developed through extensive practice under care. Eric's role was primarily to observe and assist with simple tasks like holding pieces in place while his father worked. But even these basic contributions were valuable learning experiences that would eventually develop into the full range of skills that adult men needed to maintain their property and support. The afternoon's work was interrupted by the arrival of a traveling merchant who had come to the village with a small selection of goods that were not available. The merchant, whose name was Sigurd and who traveled regularly between the various settlements of the region, brought news from other communities, as well as trade goods that included iron tools, silver ornaments, and exotic spices that had been acquired through the extensive trade networks that connected Scandinavia with the rest of Europe and beyond. His arrival was an event of considerable interest to the entire village, as it provided both an opportunity to acquire valuable goods and a source of information about conditions and events in the wider world beyond the immediate boundaries of local experience. Bjorn suspended his fence work to examine the merchant's offerings and to engage in the complex negotiations that characterized Viking trading relationships. The process of determining appropriate exchange rates for different goods required extensive knowledge of market conditions, quality assessment skills, and bargaining abilities that had been developed through years of experience with commercial transactions.
Sigurd was offering a set of iron knife blades that had been forged by skilled craftsmen in Denmark, items that would be valuable additions to Bjorn's tool collection if the price could be negotiated to acceptable levels. The merchant was particularly interested in acquiring furs and amber that were abundant in the local area, but commanded high prices in the markets of southern Europe where they were considered luxury items. The bargaining process extended over several hours, as both parties sought to achieve the best possible terms for their respective interests. Bjorn had several wolf pelts that he had acquired during the previous winter's hunting season, items that were highly valued for their warmth and durability, but that represented more fur than his family actually needed for their own use. Sigurd examined the pelts carefully, assessing their quality and condition with the expert eye of someone who had handled thousands of similar items during his years as a traveling trader. The negotiations involved not only the immediate exchange of goods, but also discussions of credit arrangements and future trading opportunities that might benefit both parties in subsequent seasons. Eventually, an agreement was reached that satisfied both the merchant and the farmer, with Bjorn trading 2 wolf pelts and a small quantity of amber for 3 high-quality knife blades and a small pouch of black pepper that Astrid would use to enhance the flavor of special meals during important celebrations and festivals. The transaction was concluded with the ritual sharing of ale that confirmed the agreement and established the ongoing relationship of mutual respect and trust that was essential for successful long-distance trading in a world where legal systems were primitive and enforcement mechanisms were limited. These personal relationships between traders and their customers were often more important than any formal contracts or written agreements, creating networks of commercial cooperation that spanned vast distances and connected diverse communities throughout Northern Europe. The merchant's visit also provided valuable information about political and economic conditions in other parts of Scandinavia, including reports of successful trading expeditions to the markets of Kiev and Constantinople that had returned with substantial profits for their organizers and participants. There were also rumors of new opportunities for trade with the Christian monasteries of Ireland and England, where Viking merchants were finding increasing acceptance as suppliers of goods that were needed by the religious communities, but were not available through traditional Christian trading networks. These reports stirred interest among some of the younger men of the village, who were considering whether to seek their fortunes through trade and exploration rather than through the more predictable but less potentially lucrative pursuits of farming and local craftsmanship. As evening approached and Sigurd prepared to continue his journey to the next village on his trading route, the normal patterns of daily life resumed for Bjorn and his family. The fence repair work was completed successfully, creating a barrier that should protect the vegetable garden from wildlife intrusion throughout the growing season. The afternoon's commercial activities had resulted in the acquisition of valuable tools and trade goods while also providing entertainment and social interaction that broke the routine of agricultural work with stimulating contact with the wider world beyond the village boundaries. These occasional visits from traveling merchants were important events in the social calendar of Viking communities, providing both economic opportunities and sources of news and information that helped to maintain connections with the broader Scandinavian culture of which each local settlement was a part. The evening meal featured some of the exotic spices that had been acquired from the merchant, with Astrid using a small quantity of the precious black pepper to enhance a dish of roasted chicken that celebrated both the successful trading transaction and the continuing prosperity of the family's agricultural enterprises. The conversation around the evening fire focused on the day's events and their implications for the family's future plans and opportunities. Eric was particularly interested in the stories that Sigurd had told about distant lands and exotic peoples, while Ingrid was fascinated by the fine craftsmanship of the silver ornaments that the merchant had displayed, even though they had been too expensive for the family's current budget. These discussions helped to broaden the children's understanding of the world beyond their immediate experience, while also reinforcing the values and priorities that would guide their development into capable and responsible adults. As the family prepared for sleep at the end of another productive day, Bjorn reflected on the ways in which Viking life combined the practical necessities of survival with the opportunities for growth, learning, and connection with the wider world that made existence meaningful and satisfying. The day had included the routine tasks of animal care and agricultural work that were essential for maintaining the family's food supply and economic security, but it had also featured social interactions, learning opportunities, and commercial activities that enriched their lives and expanded their horizons beyond the immediate requirements of subsistence. This balance between practical necessity and broader cultural engagement was characteristic of Viking civilization at its best, creating communities that were both economically viable and culturally sophisticated despite the challenging environmental conditions in which they existed. The pregnant goat that had been showing signs of approaching labor throughout the day finally gave birth during the quiet hours before dawn, producing twin kids that were healthy and vigorous despite being somewhat smaller than single births typically were. Bjorn discovered the new arrivals during his morning inspection of the livestock, finding the mother goat cleaning her offspring with the devoted attention that characterized maternal behavior throughout the animal kingdom. The successful birth was welcome news for the family, as it meant increased milk production during the coming months and the possibility of additional breeding stock for future years if both kids survived to maturity. However, it also meant additional work in caring for the young animals and ensuring that they received adequate nutrition and protection during their vulnerable early weeks of life. The care of newborn livestock required knowledge and skills that Viking farmers had developed through generations of experience with animal husbandry under the challenging conditions of Northern Europe. The kids would need to stay close to their mother for several weeks while they developed the strength and coordination necessary for independent survival. But they would also need protection from predators and harsh weather that could threaten their lives during this critical period. Bjorn constructed a small shelter within the larger livestock area, creating a warm, dry space where the goat family could bond and develop without interference from the other animals or exposure to environmental hazards that might prove fatal to creatures so young and vulnerable. The morning's discovery of the new kids provided an opportunity for Eric and Ingrid to learn about animal reproduction and care, subjects that were essential knowledge for anyone who expected to make a living from farming in the Viking world. Both children were fascinated by the tiny animals and eager to help with their care, though their enthusiasm had to be balanced against the need to avoid disturbing the natural bonding process between mother and offspring that was crucial for the kids' survival and healthy development. Under their father's careful supervision, The children were allowed to observe the animals and to assist with simple tasks like providing fresh water and clean bedding, experiences that would contribute to their development as knowledgeable and responsible farmers in their own right. The birth of the goat kids was also significant from an economic perspective, as it represented an increase in the family's livestock holdings that could eventually be converted into additional income through the sale of surplus animals or their products. Goats were particularly valuable in Viking society because they were hardy animals that could survive on marginal pasture land, and because they produced milk, meat, and hides that were useful for various domestic and commercial purposes. The successful reproduction of the family's goat herd suggested that Bjorn's animal management practices were sound, and that the family's economic prospects were continuing to improve through careful attention to all aspects of their agricultural enterprise. As the days passed and settled into the familiar rhythm of late spring activities, Bjorn found his attention increasingly focused on the preparations that would be necessary for the hay harvest, that represented one of the most critical activities of the entire agricultural year. The success or failure of the hay crop would largely determine how many animals the family could keep through the winter, and therefore how much milk, meat, and other animal products they would have available for both subsistence and trade during the months when agricultural production was impossible. The timing of the harvest required careful judgment, as cutting the grass too early would result in poor quality feed with low nutritional value, while waiting too long might mean that weather conditions would prevent proper drying and storage of the cut hay. The process of haymaking involved the entire family and required coordination with neighbors who shared access to the meadowlands that provided the bulk of the community's winter feed supplies. The work began with cutting the grass using long-handled scythes that required considerable skill to use effectively and safely, followed by spreading the cut material in thin layers that would dry quickly in the sun and wind. The dried hay then had to be gathered into bundles and transported to storage areas where it would be protected from rain and snow throughout the winter months. Each step of this process was physically demanding and time-sensitive, requiring good weather conditions and the coordinated efforts of many people working together toward the common goal of securing adequate feed supplies for the community's livestock. The social aspects of haymaking were as important as the practical work involved, as the shared labor created opportunities for community cooperation and mutual assistance that strengthened the bonds between families and neighbors. Young people often found romantic partners during the hay harvest season, when the intensive work brought together individuals from different households and provided opportunities for social interaction that might not occur during other times of the year. Stories, songs, and jokes helped to make the long hours of physical labor more enjoyable and created shared memories that would be recalled and celebrated for years to come. These social benefits were additional reasons why the hay harvest was considered one of the most important events in the Viking agricultural calendar, combining economic necessity with community celebration in ways that enriched the lives of all participants. As Bjorn prepared his scythes and other haymaking equipment for the coming harvest, he reflected on the changes that were occurring in Viking society and the ways in which traditional agricultural life was being affected by broader historical developments. The increasing influence of Christianity was bringing new ideas about everything from social organization and legal systems to artistic expression and architectural styles. Trade connections with other parts of Europe were introducing new crops, new technologies, and new economic opportunities that were gradually changing the traditional patterns of subsistence farming that had characterized Viking communities for centuries. Some of these changes offered benefits in terms of increased prosperity and expanded opportunities, while others threatened to disrupt the social cohesion and cultural traditions that had sustained Viking civilization through many generations of challenges and hardships. Despite these broader changes, the fundamental requirements of agricultural life remained constant, demanding the same combinations of hard work, practical knowledge, and cooperative spirit that had characterized farming communities throughout human history. The hay harvest would proceed according to the same basic methods that Bjorn's grandfather had used, requiring the same attention to weather conditions, the same physical stamina, and the same commitment to quality that had always been necessary for success in this essential activity. The tools might be gradually improving through better metallurgy and more sophisticated design, and the markets for surplus production might be expanding through improved transportation and communication, but the basic work of growing food and caring for livestock continued to follow patterns that connected the present generation directly to their ancestors and to the fundamental realities of life in harmony with natural cycles and environmental conditions. The evening conversations around the family hearth increasingly turned to discussions of the approaching hay harvest and the preparations that would be necessary to ensure its success. Bjorn shared his observations about the condition of the grass in various meadows and his assessment of the optimal timing for beginning the cutting work, while Astrid contributed her knowledge of weather patterns and her experience with the techniques of drying and storing hay that would preserve its nutritional value throughout the winter months. The children listened to these discussions with the attention that came from knowing that their own survival and prosperity depended on the successful completion of these seasonal activities, and they asked questions that demonstrated their growing understanding of the complex factors that influenced agricultural success in their challenging environment. These family discussions also provided opportunities to reinforce the values and traditions that guided Viking life, including the importance of hard work, the necessity of cooperation with neighbors and community members, and the wisdom of planning ahead for future needs and potential difficulties. The children learned not only the practical techniques of farming, but also the ethical principles that governed relationships within the community, and the cultural traditions that connected their family to the broader heritage of their people. These lessons were conveyed through stories, examples, and direct instruction that helped to shape the children's understanding of their place in the world and their responsibilities as future adults in Viking society. As the seasons continued their eternal cycle, and the time for hay harvest approached, Bjorn found himself thinking about the continuity of life that connected his own experiences to those of countless generations of farmers who had faced similar challenges and opportunities in the same landscape. The longhouse where his family lived had been built on the foundation of an earlier structure that had housed his grandparents, while the fields and pastures that provided their livelihood had been cleared and improved through the efforts of many previous generations of hard-working men and women. The tools he used, the techniques he employed, and the knowledge he possessed were all parts of an accumulated tradition that represented the collective wisdom and experience of his ancestors, adapted and refined through years of practical application to the specific conditions of their local environment. This sense of continuity with the past was balanced by an awareness of the changes and opportunities that were shaping the future of Viking society. The children growing up in Kaupung would face choices and possibilities that had not existed for earlier generations, including opportunities for education, travel, and careers that extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of agricultural life. The expansion of trade networks, the influence of new religious and cultural ideas, and the development of more sophisticated technologies were all creating possibilities for social mobility and cultural change that would affect the next generation in ways that were difficult to predict, but impossible to ignore. Despite these changes, the fundamental values that had sustained Viking civilization continued to provide guidance for individuals and communities seeking to navigate the challenges and opportunities of their changing world. The emphasis on personal courage, family loyalty, community cooperation, and respect for the natural environment remained as relevant as ever, even as the specific circumstances in which these values were expressed evolved in response to new conditions and possibilities. The daily life of Viking farmers like Bjorn continued to embody these traditional values while also adapting to the practical requirements of existence in a world that was becoming increasingly complex and interconnected. As Bjorn lay down to sleep at the end of another day filled with the satisfying work of caring for his family and maintaining his farm, he felt the deep contentment that comes from a life lived in accordance with one's highest values and deepest convictions. The challenges of Viking life were real and demanding, requiring constant attention to practical necessities and careful planning for future needs, but they were also opportunities for personal growth, family bonding, and community service that made existence meaningful and rewarding. The quiet heroism of daily survival, combined with the occasional adventures and celebrations that broke the routine of agricultural work, created a life that was both stable and stimulating, both secure and challenging, both traditional and adaptable to changing circumstances. Tomorrow would bring another cycle of the same essential activities, modified by seasonal changes, weather conditions, and the specific needs of family and community, but always grounded in the fundamental patterns of work, rest, social interaction, and spiritual reflection that had characterized human life since the beginning of civilization. The sun would rise on another day in the life of Bjorn Ironside, Viking farmer and family man, whose quiet dedication to the responsibilities of daily life represented the true foundation of one of history's most remarkable and influential cultures. In the end, it was not the famous raids and conquests that defined Viking civilization, but rather the countless ordinary days spent in productive work, loving relationships, and faithful service to the enduring values that connected each individual to the larger community of humanity. With these thoughts in his mind and heart, Bjorn closed his eyes and surrendered to the restorative sleep that would prepare him for whatever tomorrow might bring, knowing that he had lived this day well, and that he would face the future with the same courage, wisdom, and determination that had sustained his people through countless generations of triumph and adversity. Good night,